Hello guys, you're listening to Hydra again. I'm back with another speculation video, this time on the upcoming Psyker class. So we know very little about the Psyker class thus far, and I wanted to try and give you a few ideas as to what we could expect to see within his or her combat system. Firstly, we need to make a couple of assumptions. We have already established that within the game the equipment of the other two classes dictates your available abilities, and I see no reason why this system would differ for the Psyker class. The question then is, are we going to be a purely caster or mixture of abilities and weapons? I think the latter, and my justification is because we will likely be an Inquisitor who has picked up some psychic talents or perhaps had them nurtured by the Inquisition. I think it seems very unlikely we would be a purist astropath who just wouldn't be walking around the galaxies on their own looking for trouble. Therefore, as an inquisitorial psyker, I expect us to share some of the weapon sets and abilities with the Crusader class, but I think it's also likely we won't gain access to the heavy weapon tree, and as a trade-off I think we could expect to see 5 heavy weapons of our own, aka 4 staves. Of these, I think each would likely come with a varying skill set of each of the Psyker disciplines, and as well as this I think we could also expect the same amount of offhand weapons to allow us to make hybrid characters combining ranged, firearm, melee and spells and abilities as I see fit. Now, as I've mentioned above, the abilities of the Psykers are many and varied, and they usually fall into one of several disciplines. What I'd like to do now is go through these abilities and disciplines with you to give you a little idea as to what you could expect them to turn and translate into inside an ARPG setting. Let's go through the damage abilities first, like Blood Boil. So in this circumstance we reach inside our target, raise their blood pressure or their blood temperature, hopefully to the point where they pop. I think this could work a lot like Corpse Explosion that we typically see on Necromancers of other ARPGs. Next, we're moving on to Storm of Lightning. Okay, so 5 bolts of bioelectrical energy leap from our fingertips, jumping from enemy to enemy, so Force Lightning-ish. This could work a little bit like a heavy bolter conal attack, but instead streaming out Force Lightning. Hopefully we'll overheat every now and again and have to reload, otherwise it might get a little bit ridiculous. Now we move on to the utility-based abilities, and the first up is Choke, where much like Force Choke, there's a lot of overlap here, isn't there? Much like Force Choke, we reach out, we grab the target's windpipe with our mind, not our hand, our mind, and we simply paralyse them on the spot while they choke. It's a potential that the developers might include this as a form of incapacitation or hex ability, where a target won't start moving again until they take some damage to break this effect. Now we also have the abilities to debuff people with this tree with spells like Enfeeble that cripple the enemy, or maybe even the opposite of that where we buff our allies with something known as Warp Strength. There's lots of different potential here and many different stats that these could influence. Let's move on to a more exciting buff called Hammer Hand. This is where, using our innate knowledge, we harden the flesh of our hand and fist, turning it into a hammer. Maybe this could be some form of our ultimate ability that gives us a temporary weapon set and an amazing hammer fist to whack people with. And lastly, one worth mentioning, we have the token ability called Regenerate, where it does what it says on the tin. We give some health back to one target, either ourselves or someone else depending on who we're looking at. This could be implemented into the game. I'm not a huge fan of dedicated healers within ARPGs because that's more of an MMO style combat system, where the combat is typically slower paced, but it could work in this game, given that the combat pace is actually slightly more MMO-ish. Let's move on to the next tree now, the Telepaths, Psykers whose expertise lie in influencing the mind of others. They can send psychic messages, create emotions in their targets, and read the thoughts of their adversaries. Sounds a bit like a Witch Doctor or Warlock type mage to me. Let's have a look at the abilities and see what they got. First up is the classic Demoralize, so we reach into the target's mind and we fill them with panic and fear. Sounds like the classic Warlock ability of AoE fear or single target fear or proximity fear, makes everyone run away from you. Great if you're a squishy based character. And then we move on to another MMO type potential ability called Distraction, which works much like, well, a distraction. It causes the enemies of a set area or even a single enemy to look the other way, which would reduce their aggro range, I feel. Maybe could be implemented if these guys decide they want to pursue a more MMO style combat flow within dungeons rather than a fast-paced ARPG system. And taking us further down the route a la Warlock, we have Puppet Master, where reaching out with our mind again, we do a lot of this, the Psyker tries, or we try, to manipulate the actions of our victims. So basically we take control of someone, gaining a familiar temporarily. Kind of handy, it's been used by many warlocks and witch doctors of people of the sorts in varying games, and it has its place, certainly. And lastly, being a telepath, we also have access to the other psychic abilities like Psychic Impel, which is Force Push, Psychic Ward, which is Psychic Armour, Mind Scan, where we look at the enemies, figure out what they're going to do, and we gain some extra dodge or deflect against them. Could be implemented, could be interesting and make for some interesting builds. Now let's move on to Pyromancer, a little bit more damage orientated and a bit of fun. Let's get the crappy ability out the way first, which works like a flash grenade. It's even called Blinding Flash, and what you do is you use your mind, much like all of the other abilities, to create a blinding flash. I don't need to say much more here. They may implement this, they may not, they may feel it overlaps a little bit too much with the grenade system. The more interesting of the two is Fireball and Firestorm, which basically either throw a fireball, which will be a small area damage, or create or summon a firestorm, which is a larger area of damage. Not much else to say here, two damage based abilities which may suit an offhand. Let's move on to the last of these trees now, the Demonologists, who study all things to do with chaos and the warp. They are masters at manipulating and interacting between warp space and real space, and as such they have access to some really funky utility. First up is Instability, where if you've played Diablo 3 it allows you to move through enemies. So yes, this is taking us back to that witch doctor again. This is really helpful when you start to get overwhelmed, you're being whacked from every goddamn corner. You cast this, you can move through the enemies, you're invulnerable while you do so, and you can reposition. I feel like this could really work within the game, especially if you're pursuing a more squishy type character. And on that note, another thing we often see on squishy characters is teleportation, although often referred to within MMOs as blink, where we simply relocate forward a set distance and escape harm's way, hopefully, and not get into more trouble. Now, we've got a few more abilities in Demonology. Next up is Sanctuary, which could be a really interesting utility build. This could either work like Holy Ground, as it damages demons who approach near so, or it could be used as an impassable barrier for a set period of time which demons may not enter, something we've seen in Guild Wars 2 with the two-handed hammer. Now lastly, we might expect our super ability to be the Vortex of Chaos, which, as a vortex spell, if anyone's played the board game, summons a vortex, which is an AoE effect which swirls in a circle, thus being called a vortex, and moves in a random direction, sucking up or doing loads of damage to everything around it. I think this one is awesome and quite likely to be included. I would love to see it. So this concludes our list of available abilities to the Psyker class. We'll have to wait and see what the devs do, but I think this weapon system, offhand system, is a likely go-to point for them, so they can still integrate the character with the weapons they've already implemented in the game. We'll just have to wait and see though. I'll keep you guys updated if I find out anything new. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more content. You've been listening to Hydra. See you next time.